Additional signs of a possible food crisis in China are emerging. A bizarre phenomenon took place in Beijing where, despite the summer heat, it began suddenly snowing. And also, the United States is forming a new alliance against the CCP among Indo-Pacific powers. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. Now, during the first virus outbreak in China, concerns began to spread about possible food shortages. And now with the floods, locusts, the swine flu, and another virus outbreak now spreading in China, there are signs that food supplies may also be an issue again. Now, the state-run Xinhua news outlet reported on July 29 that wholesale prices of China's agricultural products were rising. This data included vegetables, fruits, aquatic products, livestock products, cereals, and edible vegetable oil. Reports showed that feed prices for swine farms were growing. Pork supplies were dropping because of the swine flu, and China's trying to strike deals in Argentina to find new sources of pork. Also, controversy is growing around Smithfield Foods, which was sold to a Chinese company, Shanghai International, for $4.7 billion back in 2013. Now, during the height of the virus outbreak in the United States, this pork producer and others claimed there were virus outbreaks at their facilities and warned that because of this, some could close down. This brought concerns of meat shortages in the United States. President Donald Trump intervened, however, and issued an executive order requiring that Tyson Foods, that its plant remain open. This largely ended these concerns of meat shortages in the U.S. But now, however, the companies are being investigated. Democratic Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker are actually spearheading this. They issued an open letter to the heads of Smithfield Foods, Tyson Foods, JBS USA, and Cargill, questioning why, when they were warning of shortages in the United States, they were making record exports of pork to China. Now, the case is now developing. In early July, Smithfields asked a U.S. court to prevent OSHA from obtaining documents on reports of illnesses among its employees, on test results for the CCP virus, and to prevent OSHA from interviewing its plant workers in South Dakota. Now, this is again raising questions on the legitimacy of its claims, both of the virus outbreaks and of the reasons behind claiming there would be food shortages in the U.S. And now new data is showing that while pork sales in the U.S. fell in June, exports to China rose. Meanwhile, the CCP is asking governors of various provinces in China to bear the responsibility for food in order that, quote, the food will only increase without decreasing. This has brought additional focus to rumors of food shortages in China. Again, why would they be saying that otherwise, is the big question being asked. On July 27, CCP officials held a meeting on the food situation in China, where they demanded governors assume responsibility for, quote, food security, and ordered them to, quote, comprehensively promote the implementation of the Governor Responsibility System for Food Security. Epoch Times reports that Hu Chunhua, vice premier of the State Council of the CCP, said at the meeting that it is necessary to, quote, ensure that there will be no mistakes in national food security. He continued saying this, quote, whether it is the main production area, the production and sales balance area, and the main sales area, it is necessary to ensure that the sown area and output of grain will only increase. Now, Chinese state media, China Economic Net, reported on July 28th that the CCP's railway department is opening a, quote, green channel, and this is specifically to transport grain. The report says, quote, the railway department is actively merging with the national strategy of transporting grain from the north to the south and strengthening coordination with the grain and material reserve departments. Now, even Xi Jinping, the head of the CCP, is getting on this. He commented on the food issue on July 22nd, and he said in Jilin, which is a major province for food production, that, quote, Jilin should put food security in a prominent position. And he also said, quote, in the war times, as long as the Northeast exists, stay safe and produce stably, China will be on a solid foundation. And in Dalian, meanwhile, which has been officially placed on lockdown for the CCP virus, there were reports that locals are facing food shortages. Epoch Times reported that many netizens in mainland China were posting on Weibo, which is a Chinese social media platform, that the Dalian Bay street area was suddenly shut down without warning. This goes back to July 22nd, when the CCP locked down that area because of the virus. And that because the people there weren't able to prepare ahead of time, many families in the community did not have food reserves, and some are already facing shortages. Now, as this takes place, the disasters in China are continuing. On July 28, which marked the 44th anniversary of the 1976 Tangshan earthquake in Hebei that killed close to 242,000 people, the city was hit by flash floods and torrential rains. Videos showed there was heavy flooding on the streets there. And in Chongqing, meanwhile, in Wulong district, a road collapsed on July 27th. 2 pedestrians fell into the pit that opened under their feet. Netizens were quick to criticize the road project as being a, quote, tofu project, which refers to buildings and other construction projects in China that are often built with flimsy materials, which are often the products of CCP officials embezzling funds for construction. Now, meanwhile, with these virus outbreaks, the deputy director of the Beijing Municipal Center for Disease Control and Prevention stated that a new virus case in Beijing on July 27 was linked to new outbreaks in Dalian. Now, the patient is a 53-year-old woman from Anhui province who came to Beijing on July 14th and stayed with her daughter. Her address was made public by Chinese authorities. This said, data from the CCP on numbers of cases hasn't been reliable in the past and isn't likely reliable now. But while Beijing isn't officially under lockdown, the CCP has put all the measures for lockdowns in place. And in Beijing, meanwhile, a strange anomaly was seen. Despite it being a hot summer day on July 28, it began snowing. The scene was captured on video by many residents. Local authorities claimed that it was hail, then later referred to it as, quote, soft hail. Netizens, however, said it resembled large snowflakes. Some even showed it in their hands, and videos showed this as well. Now, this phenomena lasted for close to 6 minutes. And now for the broader stories for today. First off, Taiwan sent a strong message to the Chinese Communist Party by commemorating the 70th anniversary of the battles of Kinmen's Dadan and Erdan Islands. These historical battles that started on July 26, 1950, were between Taiwan and the CCP just following the civil war in China. After the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, the CCP's military began shelling the area of the islands and later invaded with 700 troops. The defending 300 Taiwanese troops won the battle by killing 300 CCP troops and capturing 200. Taiwan News reported that during the commemoration ceremony recently, the Commander General of the Taiwanese military, Gen Pao-yu, quote, pointed out that the islands are strategically important for safeguarding the security of Taiwan, adding that the military should keep in mind its historical experience when continuing training to develop solid combat capabilities. Now, in a similar event on July 17, India's Union Minister for State for Home, Nityanand Rai, paid respects to the India Central Reserve Police Force patrol that fought against CCP soldiers during a clash on October 21st, 1959, after they were ambushed. Now, according to Hindustan Times, Rai compared the clash that happened back then to the recent fight between Indian and CCP troops in the Galwan Valley, where 20 Indian soldiers were killed by CCP soldiers. He said, quote, "What a coincidence. Whenever China attacks, its strength is huge and ours is less, but China has always suffered the consequences." Now, this is interesting in a few regards. These 2 different memorials, one in India, one in Taiwan, have the same basic context, which are battles with the CCP. Now, in broader context, this takes place just after Xi Jinping, leader of the Chinese Communist Party, visited the Xiping Battle Memorial Hall. We mentioned that in a previous episode, and the significance of that was paying respects to a battle where the CCP won against the Kuomintang, which became the government of Taiwan. Now, that was seen as Xi sending an indirect message not just to Taiwan but to the rest of the world, that it would use any means necessary to win battles to protect the interests of the CCP. Well, in that context, it seems that Taiwan has done the exact same thing, paying respects to this memorial of a battle that Taiwan won against the CCP. And India is not even trying to hide it. They're saying directly that the example of this battle that they also fought against these CCP soldiers is just like the one that recently happened, where 20 Indian soldiers were killed by the CCP. Now, this is taking place amid increasing CCP hostility, and these different countries are showing a willingness and a history of standing up to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, meanwhile, India is not backing down on its border disputes with the Chinese Communist Party. Satellite images show that the Chinese regime has been deploying additional troops and military equipment in the Aksai Chin area of Ladakh in the Himalayas, which had been seized under Mao Zedong during the CCP's invasion of Tibet in the 1950s. Now, Indian media reported that India has deployed for the first time a squadron of 12 T-90 Russian tanks, armored personnel carriers, and a full troop brigade of 4,000 men to the area. Now, this is after the Indian government assessed that the CCP is sending troops as well, who are preparing to spend the winter in the Himalayas. The CCP, meanwhile, deployed close to 50,000 troops in the Aksai Chin area. So what are we seeing here? Now, this is in relation to the incident again where Chinese soldiers killed 20 Indian soldiers in border disputes, and the CCP appeared to have orchestrated that. Again, reports had showed previously that the CCP apparently moved the troops that carried out that violence just before the incident took place, and there were also some rumors that the CCP had given direct orders to carry out the violence. Now, this was also believed to have been an action on behalf of the CCP to divert internal pressure outside of China. In other words, take the different pressures the CCP was facing inside of China and get the hardliners among the Chinese people to focus outside of China on external enemies. Now, India, meanwhile, reacted very strongly to this, probably even stronger than China anticipated. And it's begun pulling away from China both economically and diplomatically, and it's also taking stronger military stances against China, including deploying these tanks and so on to the border, but also when it comes to its maritime disputes. Now, in addition, India has banned an additional 47 apps that clone services of some of the 59 Chinese apps that it recently banned. India made headlines for the previous ban, which included TikTok, WeChat, and others. And so what does this mean? Now again, this came after findings emerged that TikTok was spying on its users. This included what appeared to be it keylogging the phones of users. In other words, as you type on your phone, it was copying everything you typed. Now, the United States has been discussing a similar ban, and U.S. government agencies are already banning TikTok. And if the U.S. does a full ban, very likely this is something we'll see spread across to other countries. Meanwhile, this similar momentum against the CCP is growing among regional powers. India, again, as we mentioned, but as well as Australia and Japan, are coming together under the United States to form a new alliance against the CCP among Indo-Pacific powers. This includes naval drills last week between the four nations, which were accompanied by the United States declaring the CCP's claims of the South China Sea are illegal, and also included backing of other alliance members on this same line when it comes to the South China Sea. Australia, for example, issued a statement saying the CCP has, quote, no legal basis for its claims, and said, quote, Australia rejects China's claims to historic rights or maritime rights and interests as established in the long course of historical practice in the South China Sea. Now, Asia Times reports that the United States now appears to be moving to build India as a, quote, firmer pillar in this alliance, known as the Quad. And this was signified by his recent invitation to the US-hosted G7 summit. It notes, quote, U.S. President Donald Trump announced his intent to host an expanded 11-member summit, also including Russia, South Korea, and Australia, in a move to counter China. And the United States is pressing Australia as well to take a stronger stance by encouraging it to hold freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. So what are we seeing here? Now, there is strong momentum against the Chinese Communist Party in countries in this region and elsewhere. And as they pivot away from the Chinese Communist Party, many of them are moving closer to the United States, as we're seeing now with India and as we're now seeing with Australia. The United States is also leading by example in some regards, such as by declaring that the CCP's claims in the South China Sea are illegal. And this makes it easier for other countries to also follow suit and make similar declarations, like we just saw with Australia. Now, similarly, other regional powers are taking a stronger stance against the CCP. The Diplomat reported that the Russian energy company Rosneft was forced to suspend plans for offshore drilling in the South China Sea under pressure from the CCP. And Vietnam has allegedly agreed to pay close to $1 billion in compensation to a Spanish oil company and to a United Arab Emirates oil company after canceling their operations in the South China Sea, again under pressure from the CCP, which has been taking stronger actions to prevent Vietnamese companies from developing oil and gas resources in the disputed territory. Now, amidst this, there are signs that Vietnam may move forward with threats made in November 2019 to sue China over its actions. Now, the Philippines had previously won a similar lawsuit against the CCP back in July 2016, and this is when The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines and against the CCP's claims to parts of the South China Sea. But Chinese leaders in that ruling refused to acknowledge it. And now, after the Philippines backed the U.S. statement declaring that nearly all the CCP's claims to the South China Sea are illegal, the country appears to be now taking a softer stance on China. Now, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte said on July 27 that the CCP is already, quote, in possession of the South China Sea, and said that pushing out the CCP may require a war that he's not willing to engage in. He said, according to Nikkei, quote, China is claiming it. We are claiming it. China has the arms. We do not have it. So it's as simple as that. And he continued, quote, we have to go to war and I cannot afford it. Maybe other presidents can, but I cannot. Now, his statements, however, were taken in context of the virus and of diplomacy with China. Alongside his statement, he also ruled out the idea of the United States establishing military bases in the Philippines, and also announced that he's pleading with CCP leader Xi Jinping to access its vaccine for the new coronavirus, which is still in development. So what are we seeing here? Politics and diplomacy play heavily into what's currently taking place. The CCP has been using what they previously called mask diplomacy, but now includes this vaccine. It's leveraging the virus to push for additional influence in different countries. It's doing this, for example, in Latin America and also with the Philippines and many other countries as well. So it's using the virus to push its interests and using the, say, promise of a vaccine to lure countries to side with it. Countries that move away from the United States, meanwhile, often lean more towards the CCP, and countries that move away from China often lean more towards the United States. In the South China Sea, this is apparent, where regional powers are getting behind the United States to stand up against the CCP's claims to the region. And now in other news, Western companies are under increasing pressure from being tied to the CCP's human rights abuses and slave labor in Xinjiang. Now, after facing pressure, the NBA cut ties to training centers in the region. Mark Tatum, the NBA's deputy commissioner, wrote in a letter, quote, the NBA has no involvement with the Xinjiang Basketball Academy for more than a year, and the relationship has been terminated. Now, this letter was sent in response to a letter from Senator Marsha Blackburn, who questioned the NBA's ties to China and to abuses in Xinjiang specifically, while also questioning how much money the Basketball Association lost by not airing games in China. That was estimated to be in the hundreds of millions, which also ties into self-censorship of the NBA when it came, for example, to supporting the Hong Kong protests. Now, Blackburn wrote in a follow-up letter that the NBA's move to abandon its presence in Xinjiang, quote, should motivate U.S. corporations to cut Communist Party ties. She stated, quote, China is responsible for some of the greatest human rights violations of our time. The NBA's decision to abandon its footprint in Xinjiang, where millions of Muslim Uyghurs have been brutally confined in re-education camps, is the right way to condemn Chinese oppression and should motivate other American corporations to decry such atrocities. Making money and standing up for human rights should not be mutually exclusive. Now, she continues, however, noting that the NBA has additional partnerships in China, such as with Chinese e-commerce company Alibaba, and noted that Chinese companies have been engaged in stealing American intellectual property. She wrote this, quote, the NBA's continued financial relationship with Alibaba requires a closer look. Now, similarly, an EU top official called out Volkswagen for being, quote, complicit in the CCP's abuses of Uyghurs. And other car companies, including General Motors, BMW, and Mercedes, are also being called out on similar grounds. And this comes on the heels of many other businesses and industries, including, for example, the apparel industry and big companies like Nike and Adidas, also being exposed and called out for using slave labor in their supply chains under the CCP's abuses of Muslim Uyghurs. And all of this comes after the United States placed sanctions on CCP officials and businesses for their involvement in human rights abuses and slave labor in Xinjiang. U.S. Treasury Department Secretary Steve Mnuchin said in a July 9th press release on that, quote, the United States is committed to using the full breadth of its financial powers to hold human rights abusers accountable in Xinjiang and across the world. So what's happening again? Now this is sending a strong message to companies that do business with the CCP, that as the Chinese regime's many human rights abuses are exposed, that these companies can be held liable and exposed with it. And so what's again happening? The United States sanctioned these different Chinese companies and these different Chinese individuals for their abuses, and along with that called out different companies for being involved as well in that region. And on a grassroots level, many of these companies have been named and shamed for their direct involvement, for example, in slavery. And so what does this mean again? Now Xinjiang is the focus of this, but across China, the Chinese Communist Party has many human rights abuses very similar to this and some on an even larger scale. Western corporations and investors have been pouring money into China, and many companies have been either directly or indirectly involved in things like slave labor and other crimes against humanity. These companies now risk being exposed and held accountable for that. And this ties into the bigger picture of companies pulling out of China. The big question is it financially viable to stay in China? Now, a few different issues on this. During this virus outbreak, many countries pulled out their businesses and supply chains from China. India, for example, and Japan, for example, even paying companies in their supply chain to leave because they saw that if the CCP decides to, for example, lock down the country, or if it decides to nationalize a company, as it did, for example, even with American mask makers, and forbade them from sending masks to the United States during a pandemic, that the CCP can do that, and that it can harm their own supply chains, their own economy, and their own interests. It is becoming a liability for them to stay in China based on this, especially as the CCP is becoming more authoritarian. But in addition to this, many companies did not pull out of China. And many companies and investors, for example, have been pouring money into China despite all of this. This made change. Because what has happened in Xinjiang with these sanctions is on two different fronts. The United States in one way is putting sanctions on CCP officials, not just for their abuses in Xinjiang, but also for what they did in Hong Kong. And it sent a message not just to the Chinese Communist Party and its leaders that they can be held accountable individually for their actions, but also to Western companies and foreign companies that they can also be held individually accountable for being involved in these abuses. And they're being told that they need to check whether their companies are involved in human rights abuses. Now, if the full issue of this were exposed, very likely we're going to see that some of these companies did this knowingly. That some of them may have known that their factories were using slave labor, at the very least based on the cost of production. That some of them, if they went and investigated these factories and found out what was taking place there and still chose to manufacture, what is going to happen to these companies? Now, even if they're not sanctioned, if it comes out on an international level that these companies have been directly involved in human rights abuses, including slave labor, what is going to happen to them? Is it a bigger liability for them, for example, to pull out and move their production to India, for example? Or is it a bigger liability for them to continue operating in China and risk being exposed or sanctioned? Now, that said, folks, again, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, so be sure to tune in. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. If you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about this show. Also, folks, we do accept donations. If you want to help us out, again, we do appreciate it. That said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.